What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Eclectic Beard. So this go around, we've got what if the United States didn't exist? Now, it's an interesting proposition, seeing as we've been, for better or worse, on the world stage, especially since the 1900s. Um, our own, here in the U.S., our own opinion of ourselves is slightly elevated, shall we say. So this look at alternative history of what if we didn't exist? Interesting concept. So let's get into it.
In the grand scheme of human history, the United States of America is an incredibly new country. From its culture and the scale of its military and economic might, the US has been influential since its inception. In the span of just 2 centuries, it went from a disunified band of colonies into the strongest power that has ever been seen.
See, with the whole, disunionized or disorganized, we're still, well, we're not exactly all together. We might be countrywide as far as all the states. Oh, look, they're a union. But as a people, we're quite disjointed. So, yeah.
Even by its creation, the United States drastically changed the course of history. So, as a thought exercise, what if it didn't exist? What if, in an alternate timeline, the United States of America never existed? Opens up a lot of questions, doesn't it? For this alternate timeline, let's go back to the 1770s, the American Revolution, as tension grew between the colonies and the British. In this alternate scenario, war begins. The American rebels fight against the British regulars. There were many numerous occasions the US could have been defeated. All it simply took was not having the aid of one foreign ally, an ally who would love to get back at the British. Yes, that's right, the French. The French involvement in the American Revolution saved the rebellion, and without it, the militias surely would have lost.
I think a lot of Americans don't quite realize exactly. And it's not only the French, but also the Prussian mercenaries that were hired by Washington and the Continental Congress at the time. The between accepting help from the French, who had just gotten through basically warring with England over in Europe, they come over here to help us. But also the Prussian mercenaries that were brought over here. They both played integral roles, and here in the U.S., it's people are going, oh yeah, that's the reason why we don't eat crumpets. Well, you don't eat crumpets because you're an idiot, you've never had them. That's just my opinion, though. However, we didn't do it alone, no way whatsoever. So the fact that that's being pointed out here, it's good. I'm glad they at least realize that, because a lot of folks just Star Spangled and all that crap.
And this wasn't a small contribution. The French involvement meant funding to rebels, supplies, guns, men, and ships, particularly to distract the British naval fleet. And France wanted revenge so badly, they put themselves in massive debt just to aid the Americans. This would come back to haunt them later, I'll talk about that soon. Say in this alternate scenario, France is more fiscally responsible and realize they can't win a war without tanking their finances, and the US is left out to dry. After years of holding out against Native American, British, and German regulars, it's just too much. So, the rebellion crumbles. The British seize control and most of the Continental Congress goes into exile or are arrested. Perhaps negotiations occur between the two to make amends, but this is hard to predict.
A little bit more than just arrested. They'd all been hung as traitors. They knew that going into it, but they'd had definitely been more than just jailed. They'd have been hung. So, that being said,
in this alternate timeline, the revolution is crushed, and the experiment that was the United States of America is in the history books, a failed rebellion over anger with the British Parliament. It can't be left unsaid that there is still bitterness among a sizable portion of the colonial population. There's still this culture within the colonies that resent the loss. While the war ends and a majority of American colonists simply move on with their lives, there's still a mentality similar to the South will rise again. The relationship between the two is forever changed. The 13 colonies were already kinda different from the rest of the British realms, but now going into the 1790s and the 19th century, it would be painted as the rogue colony which still has an independent tendency. There are immediate changes that result from the US not existing.
I do like the framing of that, though, to be honest with you, because number one, the South will rise again. I live in the southeastern United States. I have heard that literally my entire life, and I'm 40 years old now, and I still hear people say that. Not only old, but also young, which means that type of mentality is being passed down. Of course, every time they go, the South will rise again, I'm like, you do realize they played whack-a-mole, right? Um, like it's more than just Pickett's failed charge there at Gettysburg that lost the war. Just throwing that out there. But I could see how independent spirit, but I do believe if the U.S. wouldn't have got independence through the War for Independence or Revolutionary War, however you want to take and put it, if you watch this as an American, I do believe they'd have had to have a larger presence here militarily than they might have otherwise in some of the other Commonwealth nations.
When the US won the Revolution, in the Treaty of Paris, it was given all of the land east of the Mississippi River. In this alternate scenario, the 13 colonies simply remain the 13 colonies. This changes multiple things, including the path of the British imperial ambitions and the politics of North America as a whole. Let's talk relationships. In this alternate timeline, the American colonists don't have the best relationship with their neighbors. Catholic French Quebec is to the north, and would be despised by the deeply Puritan colonists, and the numerous Native Americans to the west would be an issue as well, except for a few tribes, but I'll discuss that later. In our timeline, when the US was born, Quebec was pushed up to where it is today, and the natives were under American control. But with control of this land under the British Parliament, American colonists are sort of stuck on the coast. In this scenario, Canada, as we think of it, simply doesn't exist. What eventually became Canada had a large population boost after the war from loyalists who fled the independent United States. It's said that these loyalists were the initial boost that brought Canada as a territory for Britain, being happy to be under the king's rule and all. But without independence, these loyalists stay in the colonies, so Canada doesn't have an influx of English-speaking Brits. But you know what it does have? French Canadians. This land was once under the control of the French in something known as New France, but France lost this land after the 7 Years' War. French colonists were allowed to stay and keep their culture as long as they stayed loyal to the British king. Thus, Quebec was born. In this alternate scenario, Quebec never loses this land and stays incredibly large, one that takes up all of the Great Lakes, the Ohio River, and goes up into the northern seas of the Atlantic. Had Quebec continued to be allowed to rule these lands, the Midwest and the Great Lakes are French-speaking, deeply Catholic territories. But there is a third culture as well. Most of the land south of the Ohio River is entirely populated by Native American tribes. If the treaty with the natives continued, then the British protect native.
I think one of the things that is being overlooked at this time down in the South, yes, it's mainly Native American. However, you also still have Spanish people there. You still have Spanish, not so much settlers, but explorers and stuff like that. Most of them had already been gone in the 1500s, but that is still controlled by Spain. So not only would the colonies be bordered by French land, which, to be honest with you, that would take and open up a whole different war, because there was already the French and Indian War beforehand, with the British, with the 13 colonies under British rule, and then also the French who own, in that territory they're talking about. So after quelling that rebellion, I have a feeling there'd have been a little bit more, maybe expansionism from the British side, just because the hostilities that were present at the time, especially if France never joined the war, more fiscally conservative, which means they could have actually fought. So that had been colonies bordered by territories controlled or owned by two different countries who also did not like England for the most part at the time.
Land rights in the Deep South. Inside this territory was what was known as the 5 civilized tribes by the Americans: the Creek, Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, and Seminole. They were called this because of their general acceptance of many colonial practices into their society, and the colonists held by comparison pretty good views of the natives as well, in comparison to other minorities. It was often thought that if the native tribes simply adopted European culture, they'd be on equal footing with the colonists. As decades go by in this alternate timeline, interaction with British Americans and the Quebec Canadians slowly alter these 5 tribal societies into adapting more European practices. Not much can be said other than the native tribes of the South remain prominent members who may eventually adopt colonial ways. Who knows? It's commonly taught in school that the American Revolution had an immediate impact throughout the world, and that's true, just not in the way we think. Remember when I said France was a key ally to the American rebels? That aid required money.
Yep.
That money had to come from somewhere, and the French monarchy didn't have it. The monarchy put itself into a large amount of debt. This debt created a financial crisis, and without getting into too many details, this was the crisis which led to the chain of events that eventually brought down the monarchy, led to the French Revolution, and eventually Napoleon. In this alternate timeline, Britain crushes the American rebels since France doesn't get involved.
Which means
sure, the French
Napoleon.
monarchy is still in debt, but without this financial crisis, because no war, they can kick that can down the road by at least a few decades. By doing so, Napoleon's opportunity to seize power doesn't happen. The Napoleonic Wars never occur. The Holy Roman Empire is not obliterated by the French invasion.
That'd be a massive
and
change.
Hundreds
in
of little
world
German
overall.
states aren't reorganized into 30 with the Confederation of the Rhine. There is never a rise of Prussia, and so the German Empire is never formed. It can't be underestimated how much Napoleon not coming to power affected global history, as Napoleon's forces invaded Spain and Portugal, bringing their colonies into chaos. In this alternate timeline, without the United States, there is no immediate military catastrophe to weaken these empires. They remain prominent and powerful. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the New World is still prime real estate for European colonization. The British and Spanish are pretty much the only ones left, with the Russians in Alaska, which leaves New Spain in the question. It's doubtful the Spanish would have risked war over the territory if the British wanted it enough. The British expand slowly across the North American continent. However, what changes is how they interact with the native tribes instead of the Americans. Manifest Destiny was a uniquely American ideal that wouldn't exist in this alternate timeline. Instead, it's likely the British would interact with the native tribes and give them autonomy, essentially splitting North America up into native-dominated provinces in the West, with white colonists. This is the undoubtable effect of the United States losing the Revolution and not existing, the transformation of British imperial policy around the world. Think of it like soul-searching, but with warships. Losing the United States ended the First Empire, and the British funded exploration ships to go find new lands to settle. This led to the discovery of Australia and New Zealand. It also lent to the British to become more invested in conquering lands in Africa and all of India. With North America, though, Britain simply invests in this massive territory of land. As industrial
You want to talk about massive changes to world history, like the how different it would look, because what he's saying makes complete sense. On the flip side, I could see them still expanding and going to different places, but they wouldn't need to discover some place like Australia where they've sent criminals and stuff like that. It just wouldn't. It's a very interesting concept they've got here with this video. It really is, just due to the fact of, well, the way world history in itself, because without the rise of the German Empire and then everything that happened afterwards, as far as Prussia or German Empire is concerned, well, then you might not have the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand. You wouldn't have his assassination, which led to the beginning of World War One, and because of that, due to the way that Germany was punished afterwards, the 1930s, the rise of Hitler, and the nationalization that happened there, just that nationalistic, like, all right, to heck with this, we've been under boot long enough. Like, it makes you wonder exactly how much of that wouldn't have happened, or, it's really interesting, the concept they got here. Not only that, but also the makeup of what's the U.S. right now. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating. It's something that, as an American, I'll be honest with you, I've thought about maybe a time or three, but never in the context of this, because you don't realize sometimes the underlying things that are going that wouldn't have happened possibly because of a loss by the colonies.
Civilization arrives, the British banned slavery and the slave trade as a whole. This would create extreme unrest in the United States. But the British still banned slavery, and the issue is finished by the 1830s. The British have access to the bountiful
To
amount
be honest with you, here in the U.S., outside of the South, the last slave sold outside the South was 1819. And I believe that was it? I want to say Massachusetts, but I think I'm wrong on that. Might have been Maryland. Because by 1801, New York had outlawed it. Because before that, a lot of folks don't realize that Boston and New York were bigger slave markets, or the bigger slave markets than what Charleston was. Even though Charleston was large, and so was New Orleans, there were tons that took and come through the port of New York, as well as Boston. However, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, they didn't need slaves. They had factories, so a lot of the slave owners took and either freed or sold their slaves. A lot of times plantation owners in the South and things like that. But yeah, it was by 1819, if I'm not mistaken, was the last northern state to have slavery, or at least to have legalized sale of slaves. After that, it was the South that was giving up so much resistance. So yeah.
Of oil, natural gas, and coal left untapped in North America. The change here is the balance in power in the world. Not only that, but the balance of power in Europe. Germany remains divided for the entire 19th century, meaning World War I and World War II never occur. Yet some alternate war probably would happen. As for North America, the British Dominion of North...
Well, to be honest with you, as much as everybody says we take and meddle with everybody's affairs, it's not like Europe has been exactly, war-free in its, existence. So there's that. But yeah, I'm pretty sure there probably would have been another war or two popped off. I'm not sure it'd have been like, something like the 100 Years' War, but I'm sure something would have popped off. Of course, I say that, and the U.S. with our CIA and FBI and everything else like that, and meddling in places we really shouldn't, covertly. It's a little bit different, but yeah, I'm pretty sure something probably would have popped off at some point in time over there.
North America is a diverse land. The 13 colonies still exist and are culturally different from the rest of the continent. Native Americans make up a predominant section of Western North America, while white colonists dominate the western coast. This is, however, simply one scenario. We'll never truly know what will happen. This is just one thought exercise. The United States has always been a land where people from around the world have came to create a new life. And since I'm here, and I have a life, that means that at some point in history, my ancestors had to have gotten on that boat, or flew as I like to imagine, and just stayed in the United States until generations later, I was born.
Alright, so there we have it. What if the United States didn't exist? Now, this is an interesting concept. I've thought about this, but like I said, the underlying factors that happened because of the colonies winning, never thought about the repercussions that would happen in world history, right? It's because sometimes I think whenever you consider stuff like this, your brain doesn't exactly, maybe it's not firing on all synapses or whatever the case may be, but sometimes the outcome and what happens after the outcome is a lot different maybe than what you might hypothetically otherwise think. I think the hypothetical on this is pretty interesting. Pretty interesting, because that's a lot of stuff that happened after the U.S. won the war for independence. That, Hitler and World War One, World War II, World War One, Korean War, Vietnam War. Well, there wouldn't have been any of that type of stuff. More than likely, just well, number one, Korea could have went to war with each other, and well, the U.S. wasn't there to take a step and like, that's not right. We're gonna take and defend the people in the South. It can't bring a communism over there. We wouldn't have stuff like that. Maybe another country would have stepped in, but who knows? Who knows? Vietnam, same thing. You just don't know. You don't know. So, a very interesting concept. I enjoyed this. I think this is well put together and well thought out, too. Because, as I said, I didn't considered these kind of scenarios. And I'm sure other people have probably who have possibly considered, well, what if the U.S. wouldn't have won the war for independence, or the colonies wouldn't have won their independence from England, what would have happened? And they had just been probably thinking like I did as far as the colonies were concerned, and not the global scale possibly. So very well put together, very good. Y'all be good to each other. Love yourselves. Peace.